The spring thaw came late that year, rolling down from the Wind River Range in a flood of sound and silver. Snowmelt thundered through the canyons, and the Green River rose until it spilled over its banks, dragging whole trees into its current. Along its muddy shores men built a town of hides and poles, a temporary nation born of powder, pelts, and whiskey. It was the summer of 1830, the year of the Horse Creek Rendezvous, and nowhere west of Street Louis was there a sight to match it. From dawn to dusk the air clattered with trade. The clang of iron kettles, the crack of rifle fire, the laughter of men who'd spent a year in silence. Packs of beaver pelts were flung down like treasure. Whiskey flowed from barrels into tin cups. Moccasins thudded in the dust to the rhythm of fiddle tunes. Traders from Street Louis hawked bright calico, knives, mirrors, and powder horns, while mountain men, weathered as the cliffs around them, haggled in 3 languages and half a dozen gestures. This was the great rendezvous, the frontier's own market fair, where a man could buy his future or drink it away before sundown. Among the hundreds gathered there, Crow, Shoshone, trappers, voyageurs, and merchants, one man stood apart. He was not tall, but carried himself like one who had spent his life against the wind. His coat was of patched elk hide, his beard shot through with gray, though his eyes were still sharp blue. He wore no rifle across his back, no pistol at his belt. Only a long knife hung at his side, the handle worn smooth from years of use. That man was Silas McKee, and more than one trapper swore he had taken leave of his senses. They called him the madman of the Green River. It wasn't that McKee had no skill, far from it. He had come west with the Ashley men in the mid-820s, run traps on the Yellowstone, wintered with the Crow, and crossed the Great Divide twice, when most white men barely dared to follow the Platte. His journals, if ever found, would have rivaled Jedediah Smith's for hardship and distance. But it wasn't the miles that made him famous, it was his habit of riding into Indian country unarmed. "You're a fool, McKee," said Tom Fitzpatrick one morning as they squatted over a fire blackened with bacon grease. Fitzpatrick, known as Broken Hand after a bullet took part of his fingers, was a wiry Irishman with the calm of a man who'd seen too many ambushes to waste words. A crow will laugh at you, sure enough. A Blackfoot'll just put a spear in your ribs. McKee smiled faintly, warming his hands over the coals. Then I'll give him no cause to throw it. Cause? Bridger barked from where he was oiling his rifle. Out here, cause don't matter. You could show a Blackfoot a smile, and he'll still trade your scalp for a horse blanket. Maybe so, McKee replied. But I've found a man's first arrow often follows his fear, not his anger. I take neither. With me. Bridger snorted, spitting into the dirt. Then you'll die clean, I reckon. The laughter that followed was good-natured, but uneasy. Even the young ones, Kit Carson among them, not yet the legend he would become, shook their heads. The frontier had no patience for dreamers. The country was too wide, too wild, too merciless for that. Still, McKee was no fool in the usual sense. He knew the trade as well as any man west of the Mississippi. He could set a trapline through blizzard or drought, read sign on the wind, and name the tribes by their smoke alone. Some said he'd learned the hand-talk used by the Plains tribes, a language of motion older than the fur trade itself. Others whispered he'd lived among the Crow and taken one of their women for a wife, though he never spoke of it. What set him apart was his refusal to carry a firearm when parleying with any native camp. That spring, when the rivers swelled and the packs came in heavy, the talk around Horse Creek turned to where the best pelts still ran. The streams near the Platte were trapped out, the Green had been hammered. Only the high Yellowstone country promised profit, and that was Crow and Blackfeet ground, the deadliest of all. Leave that to the bold and the stupid, Bridger warned a circle of traders over whiskey that night. Every year we lose men up there. If the mountains don't take you, the Blackfeet will. But McKee just sat in the corner, cleaning the blade of his knife with a strip of buckskin. Then maybe it's time somebody walked in without a rifle, he said quietly. The room fell silent for a beat before roaring with laughter. You'll be a fine ghost, someone jeered. Maybe they'll trade your bones for a plug of tobacco. McKee looked up, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Better to die with my word intact than live behind a trigger." That was the sort of talk that made him a legend, or a madman, depending who you asked. Outside, the night wind swept down from the peaks, carrying the smell of pine and river mud. The moonlight spilled over the camp, painting hides and wagons in a pale sheen. From the distance came the wild, rolling chant of a Shoshone circle dance, their drums echoing against the bluffs. For 1 week every summer, the wilderness itself seemed to breathe men who'd fought one another over trap lines, now shared pipes, traded jokes, and danced until dawn. The rendezvous had begun as William Ashley's bold experiment in the 1,820 seconds, a way to bring trade goods to the trappers instead of forcing them back east each season. Pack trains came up from street, Louis loaded with powder, ball, and whiskey, and went home laden with beaver skins worth their weight in silver. It was freedom, distilled the last great marketplace, untouched by cities, governments, or priests. Yet even here, where the mountains met the plains, rumor and reputation carried weight. And Silas McKee's reputation was growing faster than any man's. By the second night, the whole camp knew of his plan to ride north along the Green and into Crow country, with no musket, no pistol, and only a pack of trade goods and tobacco. Some called it courage, others suicide. A few, like Fitzpatrick, watched him with the wary respect one gives to a grizzly that doesn't charge when provoked. That evening, as fires burned low and the whiskey kegs ran dry, McKee walked alone to the riverbank. The water glimmered darkly under the stars, swollen with the snowmelt of far-off peaks. He crouched there a long while, staring at his reflection, a face lined by wind and distance, the kind of face the wilderness carved and forgot. He thought of home, though he hadn't called Scotland that in 20 years. He thought of the tribes who had taken him in, the ones who called him Smoke Hand for the way he spoke with gestures instead of words. And he thought of the rifles, the endless thunder of them, and wondered if a man might yet find another way to live among those mountains. Behind him, the camp still buzzed with laughter and song, but McKee was already a world apart. By morning, he would be gone, one man riding north, into the country of the Crow, unarmed, unafraid, and certain only of this, that trust, once given freely, was the hardest thing for a wild land to kill. And by that evening, the trappers of Horse Creek would shake their heads and mutter that the madman of the Green River had finally gone to meet his death. They were half right. He had gone to meet his fate. The first rule of the mountains was silence. By the time Silas McKee reached the upper valleys of the Green, the laughter and clamor of the rendezvous had become a memory swallowed by wind. Days passed without the sound of a human voice. His horse's hooves sank in half-frozen mud, the smell of thawing pine pitch thick in the air. The river gleamed between the willows like a strip of hammered tin. He followed it northward, where rumor said the Crow hunted elk, and the Blackfeet roamed the passes like ghosts. At night, his fire was no larger than a man's hand. A big blaze drew eyes, and eyes drew arrows. He boiled coffee in a blackened tin pot and watched the stars march west. Above the peaks, Orion hung crooked, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods like a voice from another world. Solitude didn't frighten him, it sharpened him. The old Scottish blood in him knew how to make peace with emptiness. He had learned long ago that the mountains demanded a man's full attention, the kind that came only when the world stopped shouting. It was here, amid the hush of melting snow and far-off wolf calls, that McKee began practicing his strange discipline again, the language without words. He flexed his hands before the firelight's slow, deliberate gestures, each meaning carried in the air like smoke. Friend, peace, trade, I come alone. He repeated them the way a priest might. Say prayers. Plain sign. Talk. That silent tongue was older than any treaty. Long before trappers crossed the divide, tribes from the Missouri to the Snake had used it to speak across their differences. McKee had learned it piecemeal. A motion here from a Crow, a correction there from a Nez Perce. Over years, it had become second nature. Words were dangerous on the frontier, sound traveled faster than trust, but sign carried by firelight, could build a bridge faster than powder could destroy it. He remembered the first time he had seen it used, a parley between a band of Crows and a group of Shoshone at the 1829 Rendezvous. Both tribes had come wary, their hunters stiff with pride and fear. Then one old man stepped forward, lifted his hand, and made the sign for smoke rising from one lodge. The other nodded. A single fire, one camp. The tension broke. Pipes were lit. McKee had never forgotten. Now, as the days grew longer, he wondered if that same simplicity could keep him alive. By the 10th day, he crossed into what the maps still called unknown country, though to the Crow it was home-rolling sage hills cut by snow-fed streams and dotted with cottonwood groves. Tracks marked the ground, elk, wolf, and once a moccasin print beside a pony's hoof. That night, McKee did not sleep. He tethered his horse in a shallow draw and waited. At dawn, the riders came, 6 of them, moving fast along the ridgeline Crow by their paint and feathers. They fanned out, bows strung, spears ready. McKee raised his hands slowly and stood in the open. His rifle, the one he'd carried for hunting, lay across his saddle, empty. He let them see that. The lead warrior called out, his voice sharp as flint. McKee answered with his hands. Friend. Trade. Peace. The riders slowed but did not lower their weapons. McKee could see the suspicion in their eyes. To come unarmed was unheard of. To speak with hands instead of words, stranger still. He took a pouch from his belt and held it up. Tobacco, bright red cloth, a small mirror catching the sun. Gifts of peace. He placed them on a rock and stepped back. The Crow murmured among themselves. After a long minute, the leader dismounted, stooped, and picked up the mirror. He turned it over in his hand, saw his own face in the silvered glass, and laughed softly. Then he made a sign McKee knew well. Sit. McKee sank cross-legged to the ground. The Crow joined him. There were no rifles between them, only the smoke of the small fire they kindled. When McKee offered his pipe, the warrior smiled not in mockery, but in recognition. They spoke in the oldest language on the plains, smoke curls rising straight in the morning stillness. That night, McKee camped near their lodges. He watched the women scrape hides with stone blades, their laughter mingling with the smell of roasting buffalo meat. The children trailed him shyly, pointing at his blue eyes and whispering. He understood none of their words, yet the rhythm of their camp felt more familiar than any settlement east of the mountains. One of the elders, a broad-shouldered man with hair bound in otter fur, sat beside him at the fire. He gestured toward McKee's empty rifle scabbard, then to the stars, and made the sign for mad, followed by brave. McKee smiled. Maybe both, he said quietly. The elder didn't understand the words, but he chuckled anyway. Then he drew a circle in the dust and placed 2 stones in its center. He pointed to one Crow, to the other white man. Then he pushed them together and flattened the dirt smooth. One camp. McKee nodded. The warmth in his chest was something he hadn't felt in years. Later, lying beneath a robe by the dying fire, he stared up at the wheeling stars and thought how strange it was that peace could begin with silence. In street, Louis. Men talked of the mountains as a wilderness, a place to conquer, trap, or map. But here, in the heart of it, under that vast cold sky, McKee saw something different. The wilderness did not need conquering, it needed listening. And so he slept, while beyond the firelight, the Crow guards watched over the mad white man who had come without a gun, carrying only the courage to be understood. The next morning broke cold and glass clear, the kind of light that made the mountains look close enough to touch. The air smelled of sage and damp earth, and the camp was already alive. Crow hunters rode out before sunrise, their ponies stepping lightly through the grass. The women sang as they packed dried meat into rawhide bags. McKee rose with the rest, his breath smoking in the dawn air, and felt for the first time that he was moving to their rhythm rather than his own. The Crow had given him a name during the night, Honaku Isba, which meant man who talks with smoke. He didn't fully understand its weight, but the people spoke it with respect, and that was enough. He joined the elders near the morning fire, where strips of buffalo meat hung drying on willow frames. There, talk turned to trading. The Crow, like all Plains tribes, understood commerce as a sacred balance. A fair trade honored both giver and taker. A false one poisoned the earth. McKee opened his pack's bright beads, small hatchets, knives, and ribbons, goods brought from the last rendezvous. The air filled with curiosity and laughter. He made his offers not with words, but with gesture and smoke, tracing the shapes of his bargains in the air. A strip of cloth for a pouch of tobacco, a small mirror for a bundle of arrows. Each agreement sealed by the passing of a pipe. The language of smoke was patient and exacting. A pause meant doubt, a slow exhale meant acceptance. It was trade, diplomacy, and ceremony woven into one rhythm older than any treaty paper east of the Mississippi. The Crow marveled that a white man understood this at all. They had seen plenty of trappers come through before French, American, Spanish, and most spoke only with rifles or greed. But this one sat still, eyes soft, his hands speaking like an elder's. When a young hunter offered him a bundle of beaver pelts, McKee hesitated, then shook his head. He pointed north, tracing the course of the Yellowstone with a finger in the dust. There, he signed, "More beaver. I will trap and return. Then trade fair." The hunter grinned, impressed by his honesty, and clapped him on the shoulder. That afternoon, the chief, an old man named Two Feathers, sent for him. McKee followed to a lodge painted with red handprints and buffalo tracks. Inside, the air smelled of sage and smoke. Two Feathers sat cross-legged, his eyes sharp as flint despite his years. Between them burned a small fire that hissed softly in the dim light. The chief raised both hands in greeting and began a slow, measured sequence of signs. "Why do you walk without thunder?" Meaning, "Why do you carry no gun?" McKee answered carefully, his gestures deliberate. "Guns bring fear. Fear brings death. Smoke brings peace." Two Feathers studied him for a long moment, then reached into a pouch and drew out a single eagle feather. He turned it between his fingers before laying it gently on McKee's knee. "You are either brave or mad," his sign said. "The mountains will decide." That night, McKee sat apart from the fires, watching the tribe dance beneath a rising moon. Drums echoed across the valley, low and steady as a heartbeat. The air shimmered with the heat of the flames and the cold breath of the high country. He saw faces painted red and yellow, feathers catching the light, and thought of how far this world was from the cobblestone streets of Scotland where he'd been born. And yet he felt nearer to truth here than anywhere east of the Missouri. The language of smoke was more than symbols. It was the understanding that all things spoke if a man would only listen. The wind through pine, the hiss of a river at dusk, the silence before dawn each carried meaning. McKee had come west, chasing beaver and freedom, but what he found instead was a kind of reverence for the quiet that lay beneath survival. In the weeks that followed, he lived among the Crow as one of their own. He helped mend traps by the river, taught the younger hunters how to use steel jaws instead of deadfalls, and learned from them the deep trails of the Yellowstone Basin. He began to think, half seriously, that maybe his fool's trick wasn't foolish at all. But the world beyond their valley was changing. Rumors drifted in with visiting scouts, whispers of trappers slain near the Musselshell, of Blackfeet hunting parties pushing south, angry at the encroachment of white men. The Crow grew cautious. The young warriors spoke eagerly of vengeance, their tempers sharp with pride. McKee tried to speak of peace of trade, not war, using the same careful gestures that had once bridged the gulf between stranger and friend. But fear was a language too, and it spread faster than smoke. One evening, as thunder rolled across the mountains, he watched two young warriors sharpening their lances by the fire. Their eyes burned with something he recognized, the same look he'd seen in men back at the rendezvous when whiskey and rumor mixed. He realized then that his silence, his gestures, his patience, all the things that had kept him alive, might not be enough forever. Still, he refused to take up a rifle. Instead, he packed his traps, tied them to his mule, and prepared to ride north toward the Yellowstone country. Before he left, 2 feathers stopped him, pressing the eagle feather into his hand again. When smoke cannot speak, the old man signed, "Listen to the wind. It tells you where not to walk." McKee nodded and rode out at dawn, the rising sun painting the plains gold behind him. The Crow watched him go in silence, their faces unreadable. To some he was a friend, to others a curiosity, but to all he had become a story. A white man who carried no thunder, who traded with peace instead of fear. And as the dust swallowed him, the wind rose through the valley, whispering, as if to remind them that the mountains kept their own counsel. By the time Silas McKee reached the Bighorn Basin, the land had turned to bone and shadow. The spring grasses lay flat from wind and snowmelt, and the ridges rolled out in endless gray folds toward the horizon. Smoke from distant lodges rose in thin white threads the Crow again, though scattered and wary. He had followed the river north, trapping what few beaver still lingered in the oxbows, trading salt and laughter for meat when he could. By now, every man west of the Missouri had heard something of the mad trapper who carried no gun. The Crow camp, he found that winter was smaller than before. A band of 40 souls led by a man named Little Robe, young but scarred, the kind of warrior who spoke little and watched much. McKee rode in slow, his palms open in, greeting, and was recognized at once. There were shouts, some of welcome, others of warning. A year had passed since he last sat by a Crow fire. The world had grown harder in that short time. Little Robe's eyes narrowed as McKee dismounted. "Why come back?" his gestures asked, sharp and clipped. McKee smiled faintly, lifting the eagle feather still tied to his pouch. "To trade, to learn, to live." The young chief stared a moment longer, then gave a single nod. He motioned to a lodge near the river bend, a place for guests and those under watch. McKee understood which he was. That night, the cold came down like a hammer. The hides over the lodge flapped in the wind, and the air inside smelled of smoke, tallow, and wet earth. McKee sat cross-legged by the fire, thinking of the men back at Horse Creek who would already be wintering at Fort Union or along the Platte. They'd have their whiskey, their rifles, their company. He had none of those, and yet, sitting among the Crow again, he felt oddly content. Over the next days, he worked beside the hunters, showing them a trick he had learned years earlier from a French trader, how to set double traps beneath ice, using twine and weight to lift the jaws silently from below. The Crow watched, skeptical at first, then impressed when his method brought them twice the catch. They called it the fool's bargain, a clever trick born of a man too simple to fight, who fought the earth instead. It was Little Robe himself who tested McKee's worth. On the 5th morning, he appeared outside the lodge with 3 young warriors and motioned for McKee to mount up. They carried bows and spears, and the air was sharp with the scent of storm. Hunt, the single sign, was all he gave. They rode west into the foothills, where elk herds grazed between the snowdrifts. McKee knew the land he had trapped here before, and he guided them along the frozen creek beds where the wind cut least. Near dusk, they found sign, fresh, droppings, prints deep in the snow. The warriors spread out, their ponies silent as ghosts. When the herd broke, McKee didn't fire. He had nothing to fire. Instead, he slipped from the saddle and gave a piercing whistle that echoed through the canyon. The elk froze just long enough for the warriors to loose their arrows. 2 fell clean. 1 bolted, wounded, vanishing into the timber. The young hunters shouted and whooped, chasing after it. McKee followed the blood trail into a narrow ravine and found the animal collapsed against a fallen tree, its sides heaving. He knelt, resting a hand on its neck. "Easy, friend," he murmured, drawing his knife. With a single stroke, he gave mercy. Then he whispered a few words he'd learned from the Crow, an offering to the spirit of the hunt. When Little Robe arrived, he saw the elk laid neatly, the knife wiped clean, and McKee standing over it with bowed head. The young chief said nothing, but his eyes softened. That night, they feasted. Smoke curled from every lodge, and the camp rang with laughter again. McKee sat near the fire, chewing meat and listening to the drums. For the first time, the Crow did not treat him as a curiosity. He was one of them now, a man who could hunt, who could share silence, who could be trusted. Later, as the embers dimmed, Little Robe sat beside him and gestured toward the stars. "Crow and white man," he signed. "Different paths. Same sky." McKee nodded. Then the chief made another motion, slower, deliberate. "Blackfeet come soon." McKee frowned. He'd heard the same rumors farther south, that the Blackfeet had been pushing down from the Yellowstone, angry at the trappers who raided their streams and stole their horses. They had sworn to drive every white man out. "They hunt you," Little Robe warned, drawing a line across his palm, "and all who walk with you." McKee's throat went dry. "Then I'll walk with no one," he said softly, though he knew the Crow would not understand. But they understood enough. When dawn came, he packed his gear in silence. The women brought him smoked meat and a pair of snowshoes. Little Robe offered no farewell, only a single nod and the gesture for walk well. As he rode north along the frozen river, McKee looked back once at the smoke curling above the lodges. He felt the strange pull of two worlds, one fading, one being born, and wondered how long a man could balance between them. His so-called fool's bargain had bought him peace among one tribe, but it might cost him his life among the next. Still, he rode on. The land stretched before him like an open ledger, snow, stone, and sky, and in his heart he carried a single, stubborn belief, that trust once offered could be a weapon sharper than any blade. The mountains would soon test that faith. And before the snows melted, Silas McKee would learn just how high a price a man paid for the right to walk without fear. The Yellowstone ran high that spring, swollen with snowmelt and the bodies of trees torn loose from the mountains. Its waters glimmered pale green beneath the cloudy sky, restless as the land itself. Silas McKee followed the river north, his traps packed away, his horse lean from winter. The country grew rougher, the ridges sharper. Smoke from distant fires rose along the eastern horizon, too many for one camp. The Crow had been right. The Blackfeet were moving south. McKee had no illusions left about safety. Out here, a man was as mortal as his shadow, yet he still rode with his rifle empty and slung low across his saddle, not defiance, but faith. It had worked before. It would have to work again. 2 days' travel brought him to a small clearing where the river bent against a wall of basalt cliffs. There he found the aftermath of violence. The ground was trampled, the ashes of a camp still warm. He counted 3 dead ponies, stripped of saddles. The grass bore stains that the wind could not hide. He dismounted and knelt, fingers brushing the dirt. The arrows left behind were crow-made, goose-feathered, their shafts blackened with soot. But the moccasin tracks around the camp were not crow. The prints were smaller, narrower Blackfeet. A fight, then a rout. He built no fire that night. He chewed on cold venison and listened to the wind. Every few minutes it carried a sound that was not its own, a distant crack of wood, a splash upriver, the murmur of voices moving through trees. He slept little. At dawn, the voices became faces. 4 riders appeared on the ridge above the river, their ponies slick with dew, their spears painted red. McKee stood in the open, hands raised. He signed slowly, deliberately, "Friend, peace." "Trade." The riders paused. They had expected fear. One dismounted and advanced cautiously, bow half drawn. McKee motioned again, repeating the gesture. No thunder, no harm. Then, to make his meaning clear, he reached into his pouch and drew out a small bundle wrapped in red cloth, tobacco, and beads, a gift of goodwill. The warrior halted, studying him with eyes as cold as the river. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then another rider shouted from behind in Blackfeet, and the man before him raised his bow. McKee froze. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He made one final gesture, smoke, one lodge, peace. The arrow hissed past his shoulder, burying itself in the dirt. A warning, not a death sentence. The lead warrior barked a command, and the others lowered their bows slightly. Then, with a curt motion, he pointed north, the universal sign for go. McKee nodded. He turned his horse slowly and rode upriver. When he looked back, they were gone. By midday, he had crossed into country scarred by fresh trails, deep ruts, broken branches, a scatter of trampled grass, signs of a moving camp, large and angry. He guessed it right. A Blackfeet war party hunting down a Crow band. If so, the river would soon run red again. Near sunset, the first smoke rose ahead, a dark, oily column against the sky. McKee's stomach tightened. He urged his horse forward until the smell of burning hair and hide hit him like a wall. The Crow camp was gone. Hide lodges lay torn open, their poles scattered. Dead ponies lined the riverbank. He found a child's toy near the ashes, a carved elk, half charred. There were bodies, too many to count, left for the crows that now circled overhead. Among them, one he recognized, Little Robe, the young chief who had once signed Same Sky beneath the stars. The arrow that killed him was still lodged in his ribs. McKee knelt beside the corpse, his hands trembling. The air reeked of smoke and iron. He whispered a few words in the Crow tongue, a broken prayer he barely understood, and covered the man's face with his robe. He wanted to turn away, to ride until the wind erased it all. But something in him refused. For 2 days he stayed. He gathered the dead where he could, stacking stones over the bodies so the wolves would not take them. He burned what was left of the camp, sending its smoke high into the mountain wind, a signal of mourning and warning both. When the fire burned low, he sat beside it and stared into the coals until the world blurred. He thought of the trappers at Fort Union, the drunken laughter at Horse Creek, the easy talk of profit and adventure. None of them would ever see this. None would ever understand what the wilderness demanded in payment. By the 3rd morning, a soft snow began to fall. The flakes melted on his cheeks, mingling with the smoke. He packed his gear, tied the eagle feather to his hat, and mounted up. He rode slow along the river, the hoofbeats muffled by snow. At a bend in the trail, he stopped and looked back one last time. The smoke had thinned, but still rose, a gray thread twisting into the pale sky. He lifted his hand, the old sign for farewell. Then he turned his horse toward the west, where the land rose again into the high country. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the Snake and the Green, where men still trapped, still dreamed, still died for furs and glory. But Silas McKee rode for something else now, not trade, not gold, not legend. He rode because there was no other way to honor the living but to keep moving through the land that had claimed the dead. The river murmured beside him, cold and eternal. The mountains loomed dark ahead. And as he disappeared into their shadow, the last echo of the Crow drums seemed to follow, faint, steady, and sorrowful, the heartbeat of a world already vanishing. By the summer of 1834, the mountains had changed. The wild silence that once ruled the high country now carried a new sound, the jangle of harness, the squeal of wagon axles, the clatter of iron pots swinging from yokes. Civilization, ragged and determined, was crawling over the Continental Divide. The Oregon Trail was not yet a highway, but its bones were forming in ruts and hoofprints across the sage. The age of the free trapper was dying, and men like Silas McKee could feel the breath of its ghost in every valley. South Pass, broad, gentle, almost deceitful in its ease, had become the crossroads of an empire not yet born. On that windswept plateau, where the Wind River Range fell away into plains, 2 worlds met. The bearded buckskin world of the mountain men and the creaking, hopeful world of settlers. McKee had watched them come for 3 seasons now, families from Missouri, wide-eyed boys seeking fortune, surveyors with maps and measuring chains. They carried a kind of confidence that seemed almost holy, but to McKee it felt like thunder building on a clear day. He rode alone still, though not entirely without purpose. Word had spread that Captain Benjamin Bonneville was leading an expedition through the region, part military, part merchant, and part myth. McKee had crossed trails with his men near the Sweetwater River, where wagons stood in half, circles like forts. Bonneville's interpreter, a wiry French half-breed named Etienne Provost, recognized McKee at once. "Madman of the Green," Provost said with a grin. They still tell stories about you in Street Louis. Thought you were dead." McKee smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." Provost's grin faltered. "Bonneville could use a man like you, knows the country, knows the tribes." And so, for a time, McKee rode with them. The Bonneville party was unlike any McKee had known. Their mules carried rifles, survey instruments, even books. They spoke of mapping rivers, building forts, making treaties. McKee listened but said little. He had lived too long in the country of the unsaid. When they reached the headwaters of the Green, they made camp near a grove of cottonwoods. That night, Bonneville himself came to McKee's fire, a square-jawed man with an officer's bearing and a missionary's zeal. "I've heard of you," Bonneville said. "The man who walks among tribes without a weapon. I'd like to understand how." McKee poked the fire with a stick. "It isn't hard, Captain. You listen before you speak. You give before you take. You show your hands before your heart starts beating too fast." Bonneville nodded thoughtfully. "And they trust you?" "Sometimes," McKee said. "Until someone with a flag or a contract comes along and teaches them not to." The captain frowned, unsure whether he'd been insulted, but he didn't press the matter. Days later, they rode east toward South Pass, where a mixed band of Shoshone and Crow awaited trade. McKee rode ahead as interpreter, though his language was more smoke and gesture than words. The tribes greeted him with the cautious warmth of memory. Some had heard of the white man with no thunder, and others remembered him from the Crow valleys. He dismounted and stepped forward slowly, showing the feather still tied to his pouch. Friend, trade, one fire. The signs were the same, the meaning unchanged. The meeting began as all good parley did, with silence. Then came the offering of gifts: beads, cloth, and knives from Bonneville's men, buffalo robes, and dried meat from the tribes. McKee moved between them like smoke itself, translating gesture to trust. When a misunderstanding flared, a young Shoshone offended by a trader's careless laugh, McKee was there, his hands rising in the calm rhythm of peace. The tension broke like a wave against stone. Bonneville watched from his horse, eyes narrowed with respect. "Remarkable," he murmured. "He does more with his fingers than I could with a company of soldiers." McKee heard and smiled, but inside, a quiet ache was growing. Every trade, every handshake, every puff of shared pipe felt like the last of something. The land that had once belonged to silence was filling with noise. That night, after the camp had quieted, he walked to the edge of the bluff overlooking the pass. The wind cut cold off the Ananaras mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow, even in July. Below, the fires of Bonneville's wagons glimmered like stars scattered on the earth. Beyond them stretched the dark sweep of the plains, the future, waiting impatiently. A figure approached Provost again, his breath white in the moonlight. "They'll write about this, you know," he said. "The first great crossing, Bonneville's Trail, the new road to Oregon." McKee shook his head. "No road stays new for long. The first trail just shows the others where to cut deeper." Provost squinted at him. "You don't believe in progress?" "I believe in consequence," McKee replied. They stood in silence for a time, listening to the wind hum through the sage. Somewhere far off, a wolf called long, lonely, and thin. "Do you ever miss people?" Provost asked finally. McKee smiled faintly. "I've spent half my life trying not to." Provost laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're a strange man." "Silas." "Maybe so," McKee said. "But the mountains understand me." When morning came, he was gone. No one saw him leave, but his tracks led south, away from the wagons, toward the rough country near the Sweetwater. Bonneville noted it in his journal with a single line: "Silas McKee departed at dawn, the last of the old breed." He rode alone again, as he always had, following the wind and the faint curl of smoke from some unseen camp. Behind him, the world was changing iron, maps, and manifest destiny. Ahead lay only the wilderness, the same as it had ever been. And somewhere in that vast silence, the man who had once been called mad carried on his fool's bargain, trusting that in a land full of thunder, a little smoke might still speak louder than a gun. By the spring of 1859, the Missouri smelled of mud, steamboat smoke, and rain. Independence was no longer the rough little outpost McKee remembered from his youth, but a bustling frontier town of brick, buildings, wagon yards, and telegraph lines humming like steel insects. The West he had known the world of pelts and powder, of rendezvous and rivers had vanished. Silas McKee was an old man now. His beard had gone white as mountain frost, and his hands, once steady as traps in snow, trembled when he lit his pipe. He lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, not far from the Santa Fe Trail. The settlers called him Old Smoke Hand, though few knew the story behind it. He lived quietly, trapping small game, mending tools for travelers, and selling furs to the trading post. The young men laughed at his tales at the idea that a man could cross Crow Country unarmed, that he could trade peace for pelts and live to tell of it. The world had changed. Out west, forts flew flags now. Soldiers patrolled the rivers where beaver once swam. Treaties were written in ink instead of smoke. But some nights, when the wind came down from the hills and the smell of sage drifted faintly across the prairie, McKee could almost hear the old sounds again, the hammering of tents, the calls in French and Crow and English mingled together. The mountain men had been ghosts even in their own time. Now they were only legends. One evening, a young man knocked on his door. He wore a clerk's vest and spectacles that fogged in the spring damp. "Sir," the boy said, "I'm collecting accounts for the Territorial Survey Office. We're compiling records of the early fur trade. Would you be Mr. Silas McKee?" McKee chuckled, his voice rough as gravel. "What's left of him?" The clerk's eyes lit up. "Then you're in the ledgers of the American Fur Company. I've seen your name beside Fitzpatrick, Bridger, and Provost. They called you the man who traded with every tribe from the Platte to the Yellowstone." McKee puffed his pipe. "That's a long stretch of country to fit in one sentence." "If you don't mind," the boy said, "I'd like to ask you about your method, this business of traveling unarmed." McKee leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the worn lines of his face. They called it foolish then, too. But it wasn't bravery. It was arithmetic. You go into a man's camp carrying thunder, and he measures you by how loud it sounds. You go in empty-handed, and he has to look at your eyes instead. The clerk wrote furiously. "So you trusted them completely?" McKee smiled faintly. "No, son. I trusted myself to die honest if it came to it. That's all any man can do." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The old trapper stared into the fire, its glow reflected in his faded blue eyes. "You ever see smoke talk, boy?" The clerk looked puzzled. "Smoke talk?" "Two fires, miles apart," McKee said softly, "each sending its breath into the sky, a wordless kind of truth. That's how men spoke once, before ink and telegraph wire. That's how peace began." The boy hesitated. "Do you ever wish you'd written it all down?" McKee shook his head. "Words fade, smoke drifts, but a man's deeds, they stay somewhere. The mountains remember, even if people don't." That summer, the clerk returned with a document and official certificate from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At the bottom, in neat script, was a note. Silas McKee, recognized by multiple tribal accounts as a neutral trader and peace intermediary, active 1,827, 1,836. The old man laughed when he saw it. "A paper for what was never written," he said, but he thanked the boy anyway. A month later, McKee walked down to the river for the last time. The banks were heavy with cottonwood fluff, the air buzzing with insects. He sat on a log and watched a steamboat churn upriver, its paddle wheel slapping the brown water. The sight should have filled him with wonder, progress, power, the march of a new age. But he felt only distance, like a man watching the tide erase his footprints. He took the eagle feather from his hat, worn now and faded, and held it up to the wind. It had traveled with him from the Green River to the Yellowstone and back again. It had seen peace and death, smoke and silence. With a sigh, he let it go. The breeze caught it, lifting it high before carrying it out across the water, where it vanished into the light. McKee smiled then, not sadly, but as a man who'd finished his trail. He closed his eyes, listening to the murmur of the river. And in that sound he heard all the old voices again. The laughter at Horse Creek, the chant of the crow drums, the crack of ice on the Big Horn, the language of smoke rising straight and sure into the open sky. When the townsfolk found him the next morning, he was still sitting upright, his pipe cold, his face peaceful. The paper certificate lay folded in his pocket, unsigned. They buried him on a hill overlooking the river. No preacher, no ceremony, just a few trappers, who still remembered the old ways. The clerk placed a simple marker of stone, Silas McKee, the man without enemies. He came in peace, and peace followed. And when the wind rose that evening, carrying dust from the west, some swore they saw it twist and shimmer like smoke, the last message of a mountain man who had never needed a gun to make his mark.